Hello, humans. This is the third in my series of stuff about acu-moxa in ancient times, bleeding, and so forth. This time I want to talk about point functions and point indications and what that was like back then. I'll tell you, when I went to school in the mid 80s, 1980s, um, you know, there was only one book that had point functions, and that was called Acupuncture Comprehensive Text, the Shanghai text, and it didn't have functions for every point. It only had functions for some points. And why? Because functions are a new thing, and they were just working that out in the second half of the 20th century. So let's see what points were, how points were discussed in ancient times. There we go. So, after the People's Republic of China was founded, and after they decided to embrace Chinese medicine, so early 1950s, they wanted to unify Chinese medicine into one school of thought and make it easier to be taught in schools. Mm, they actually considered dumping acupuncture. Herbalism was higher status, and it's also easier for the modern mind to understand how herbs have components, chemicals that can do things, and it's hard to understand how acupuncture can do things. So they were thinking of not embracing acupuncture, and one of the things that helped them to do it was to make the teaching of acupuncture more similar to the teaching of herbs. So they herbalized acupuncture. Herbs and herbal formulas have functions like Xiaoyao San, moves liver qi, and Sujun Zitang supplements qi, and Suotang nourishes blood, and so forth. So formulas have always pretty much had functions like that, and indications. So indications are the signs and symptoms, and functions are what it's doing in Chinese medicine terminology, like clears heat, drains damp. Those are functions. But indications are like difficult urination and blood in the urine and turbid urine, and those are indications. And the acupuncture books have always listed indications, but they didn't have functions until after 1950, when these committees tried to analyze the indications and come up with functions for the points. I know it may be hard to believe if, ever since you started learning acupuncture, they told you, these are the functions of Li4, then you're used to thinking in terms of functions, but that's really relatively new. Now, I actually like it. I'm not complaining about functions. I just think that people should understand the history and be accurate when they're talking about history, rather than thinking everything goes back 2,000 years or 5,000 years or whatever, because there's been so much innovation in Chinese medicine. And I do think in terms of point functions. That's how I was trained when I was in school. But like I said, they were added in, and they weren't even completely added in when I was a student. But now, most Westerners don't know what to do without point functions. And so, people complain about CAM, Chinese acupuncture, and Matsubastian, that book that's a major textbook, because it has only indications, it doesn't have functions. But actually, what I've come to understand is CAM is much closer to Chinese medicine as it was, to acupuncture as it was, than it is to, it's more accurate in a way historically. Those indications are indications that have always been listed, for hundreds or more than 1,000 years. So, okay, let's do this slideshow. Yeah, indications have been used for, almost 2000 years or about 2000 years. So let's look at an example of a point entry in Zhenzhou Dacheng. So I should say, of course, that's a Ming Dynasty document. It was published in 1601. And basically, he took information from all the previous acupuncture manuals and put it together along with some of his own thought. But he's writing, Yang Jizhou, the author, is writing in a very, you know, traditional way, and he quotes from the old books, and he's not making stuff up. He's basing pretty much everything he says on the older books from his time, and a little bit on his clinical experience, but he's not adding new theories or anything. He's just doing it the traditional way. So let's just look at a point. I chose lung 5 as pretty much representative. And so the first thing it's going to say in the section of Zhenzhou Dacheng, where it goes over the points one by one, and earlier acupuncture texts will have a similar format. The first thing is the location. So it's on the vessel in the elbow crease. It's in the transverse crease when the elbow is bent, in the concavity between the sinew and the bone. Okay. Maybe it could be more precise if they added in Western anatomical terms. But of course, nobody's going to learn this just from a book. They're going to learn it from a teacher. So this is enough for you to remember where it is, and you've had the teacher show you where it is. So that's the first part. The second thing is, if it's a point that belongs to a point category, is going to talk about that. The place of entering on the Han Tai Yin vessel, lung vessel, is the He Si point, or the He uniting point, water element. Drain it when there's excess of the lungs. So in modern times, we would phrase this differently, but Ling Shu tells us that the He Si point is where qi enters the Si and goes deeper. So when he says the place of entering, anybody back in those days, here's entering, anybody back in those days would know that meant the He Si point. It might go over some of our heads, but saying that the place of entering, he says that for every He Si point, it's based on Ling Shu. They often, in Ling Shu, they often use the word vessel when we would say channel. So this just really means channel, but they use the word vessel instead. And then sometimes later books, when they're quoting from it or talking in that style of the earlier books, they'll use vessel instead of channel. Okay, so the He Si point, which is water element on the yin channels, and then drain it when there's excess of the lungs. Why? Because it's the sun or the child point. This is the water point. Water drains the metal of the lungs. So instead of saying this is the child point, he just says drain it when there's excess of the lungs, and then you would know it's the, son or the child. And then there's needling instructions, something which we talked about a little bit in the first of these 3 videos that I've made. So needle 3 fun deep. That means 3/10 of a tsun, about 1/3 of a tsun deep. Retain it for 3 exhalations, which means 3 breaths, because you can't have exhalations without an inhalation. Apply 5 cones of moxa. That doesn't mean you have to do all of that. You could just do moxa, or you could just needle, 3 fun deep for 3 exhalations, or you could do both things. Those aren't, you don't have to do both of those things, but he's telling you how many cones are the traditional amount for that particular point, just based on, what his medical ancestors, to use Leo Locke's phrase, what his medical ancestors have recorded. So he passes that along. Okay, so now we know its location, we know its point categories, We know how to needle and how to moxa it. And then it has indications. Actually, it uses a word that's often translated as governing, or it governs this, this, and that. But what this really means is indications. And when this is used in certain phrases, then yeah, it means indications. So indications are signs and symptoms. Okay, so what does lung 5 treat? Shoulder and arm pain, sweating and wind strike. So that means external wind attack and the patient is sweating. So it's not cold, it's wind. Because when cold invades, then there's no sweating. When wind invades, it means the patient's a little bit deficient, and so Wei Qi is not so strong, so they're sweating. Frequent urination, sneezing, sorrowful crying. So, these are not one particular pattern. These are, random signs and symptoms. Well, of course, sorrow is the emotion of the lungs, and crying is the sound of the lungs. When you have external wind attack, you might be sneezing. And, the lungs descend fluids towards the urinary bladder and they contribute to urine. So maybe somehow that has to do with the urination thing. Cold, heat, or wind bee patterns. You would guess that probably means affecting the arm. Hypertonicity of the upper arm and elbow. So hypertonicity is like cramps or spasms or tightness of the upper arm and elbow. Well, that's just local channel, adjacent channel kind of problems. Inability to raise the hand and arm because, of arm problems. So if you move chi through the channels, then the arm will have more mobility. Throat bee, which means sore throat, basically. And so the lungs govern the throat in large part. Ascent of chi with retching and vomiting. So when lung chi counterflows, it's easy for stomach chi to counterflow, and vice versa. In the the chi mechanism, when one organ's chi starts moving improperly, it's really easy to mess up the rest of the mechanism. And so, lung and stomach chi counterflow can go together. And so, if this is really vomiting and so forth, you probably would mainly pick stomach channel points, but lung channel points can help. Both lungs and stomach should descend, and now they're ascending. Dry mouth, coughing and spitting turbid fluid. So coughing, of course, and spitting out, phlegm or turbid fluids, lungs. Okay. So a certain type of malaria, I haven't studied malaria deeply, but that's a specific type of malaria. Swelling of the four limbs and abdomen. The lungs govern the upper waterways, and so this would be water swelling. It says four limbs, often things say that, but it may mean the focus is on the arms because lungs are going to govern the upper part more than the lower part, but anyway, so since lungs do descend some fluids and help promote urination in that respect, it's again referring to that. Heart pain with arm pain. The lungs and the heart are the two organs of the upper jaw. A lot of the time the symptoms don't make perfect sense to us, but they're things that have been recorded in, previous acu-moxa books, and he passes them along. Shortness of breath. Okay, that makes sense. This is a lung point. Lung inflation. So I don't know, it's kind of another respiratory problem. Let's not worry about it too much right now. Heart vexation and oppression. So if the lungs are messed up, the chest is messed up. And that can mess up the heart. Heart and lungs are going to interact with each other because they're adjacent. The heart is the emperor and the lungs are the prime minister. So we saw some other heart symptoms somewhere up above. Okay, shortage of chi, which means shortness of breath. Okay, it doesn't mean chi deficiency, it means shortness of breath. Taxation heat. Okay, so taxation is, you've been working too hard and your body becomes run down, and it's so severely run down, just resting a little bit and eating a good meal isn't going to fix it. So taxation is going to be deficiency, and deficiency with heat is yin deficiency. And so this is going to be talking about lung yin deficiency. That's basically suggesting. Panting and fullness of the chest and lungs. Okay, so at least panting, gasping for breath is going to be the chest. And chest fullness, if you have a lot of phlegm, something like that, you have a feeling of chest fullness. Stiffness and pain of the lumbar spine, well, that's a little weird, but that's what it says. Chronic childhood fright wind, which means infantile convulsions, which often comes from a high fever, and a high fever comes from external contraction, which involves the lungs and wei qi. And when you have external contraction and fever, you often have breathing difficulty. So, some of this just is hard for to really understand why would lung 5 do that. But and some of the fluid stuff, this is the water point on the channel, so that may contribute to it. This is how they talk. Notice it doesn't say clears heat, transforms phlegm, descends lung qi. It doesn't say anything like that. And then if you find those functions in modern point books, it's because the committees in the 1950s combed through this and decided what would make the most sense. And again, I'm not opposed to point functions. I'm just saying that they're relatively new. This is 1601. There are no point functions here. They're just indications. Let's look at another example. Stomach 6, jiacha, is, of course, on the jaw. Oh, they always give alternate names. We don't care too much. So it's 8 fun below the ear, 8/10 of a chun below the ear, in the concavity near the anterior end of the angle of the jaw. Find it with the patient lying on their side. It's in the hollow that appears when the mouth is open. Yeah, you can kind of feel it when you open the mouth. Okay. So Bronze Man is Tongren. He wasn't quoting from ancient books before, I guess, because they were all in agreement with lung 5. But now there's some disagreement with some of the information from the old book. So Tongren, the Bronze Man, went over the points one by one. That says to needle 4 fun deep, 4/10 of a tsun deep, obtain chi, and then use a draining hand technique. You can also apply 7 cones of moxa per day, but stop at 7 times 7 cones because you don't want too much moxa on the head generally. So that implies that this is going to be 7 cones a day for 7 days. I talked about that in the video about moxa in ancient times. The cone should be the size of a grain of wheat. So this is giving more information about the moxa than the previous one. Bright Hall, which is Mingtang, another ancient book, says to apply 3 cones. So this one says 7, Tongren says 7, and Mingtang says 3 cones. And the notes to Suen say to needle 3 fun deep rather than 4 fun deep. So the notes to Suen Wang Bi was the editor of Su Wen and got it published in the Tang Dynasty, but he annotated it. And so this is Wang Bing's annotations to Su Wen. And so you can see when different books say different things, then the old book, instead of him telling you how you should do it, he tells you what the earlier book said, and you can make up your own mind. And then indications. Windstroke with clenched jaws. Of course, this is going to treat the clenched jaws and not directly treat the windstroke. Clenched jaws preventing speech, loss of voice. So this loss of voice, does this mean you've got laryngitis and voice won't come out? Or does it mean a mute person who can't speak? Or does it mean, it just said clenched jaws preventing speech? It's really unclear, but that's what it says. Of course, jaw pain, swelling under the chin and in the cheeks. It's local for that. Inability of the teeth to chew things. Doesn't say why. Is it painful? Or what? But if your jaw is clenched, you can't chew. Maybe if it's painful, you also can't chew. Stiff neck with inability to turn the neck. That's weird for this point, but that's what it says. And then facial paralysis, which they usually call deviation of the mouth and eyes. The Yang Ming channels govern the face and sense organs, and this is a local point that's commonly used in facial paralysis. You can see lung 5 was more important point, and that this stomach 6 is mostly local stuff. That's generally the case. Let's look at naguan, pericardium 6. Between the two sinews proximal to the palms, tutsun from the wrist, at the same level as waiguan sanjiao 5 on the opposite side. Okay, so we've got location, and that agrees with what we say today. The low networks of the hand-heart governor diverges and runs to the Shaoyang from here. So this is the low point. That's what it's telling you. It doesn't just say this is the low point. It says the low vessel of the pericardium channel runs to the Shaoyang Sanjiao channel from here. And so that's just how it phrases it. So we could just say, oh, this is the low point, but they always phrase it differently. And then Bronze Man, we already met that. That's, Tongren, one of the earlier books, says to needle 5 fun deep, half a tsun, and apply 3 cones of moxa, or apply 3 cones of moxa. Okay, let's look at the indications. It's surprising. This really doesn't have many indications. Today, pericardium 6 is a super important point, but if we look at lung 5 was, had much more that it could do. And generally, the more indications a point has, the more important it probably is. So we saw that the local point, stomach 6, has fewer indications, than lung 5, which is used as a distal point for many things. So you can kind of judge how important a point is by how much text it has in a book. Okay, so indications. Wind, heat in the hands. That's what it says. Okay. Loss of will, loss of mind. It's that word zhi, which is the spirit of the kidneys, but it also is used to mean mind. Like, for example, the 5 element emotions are called the 5 zhi, the 5 minds, the 5 wills. Okay, heart pain, red eyes, propping fullness is a feeling in the rib side region, like something like, how if you prop a board up against the wall, it's a feeling like something's propped up against your rib sides from the inside. And hypertonicity of the elbow. So, a tight elbow. So this is like a, adjacent or distal point for certain elbow issues. That's very many symptoms. And think about what main symptom we think of pericardium 6 for that's missing. Okay, I'll tell you in a minute. So the low points in Lingshu 10 have symptoms of excess and symptoms of deficiency when the low vessel is excess or deficient. So in excess, there's sudden heart pain, drain it. In deficiency, there's stiffness of the head, supplement it. So those are symptoms from Lingshu for the low vessel of the pericardium, or at least they should be. And that's what that should be. So a lot of this, it doesn't like directly say this is the low point and here's the symptoms of excess and deficiency when the blood vessel is out of balance. It just like states things a certain way and expects you to know. So what's missing? Vomiting. Isn't pericardium 6 a major point to treat vomiting today? So, okay, it has heart pain. Okay, and it has some things that are kind of related to emotions, not in great detail, but a little bit. Okay. Doesn't have stomach issues. We use pericardium 6 a lot for epigastric pain or, other stomach issues. There's not one stomach issue listed here. This is Genjo Dacheng. You can't argue with Genjo Dacheng. This is like the peak of Chinese medicine and acupuncture. So what's going on here that there's no vomiting? Yeah, many point actions that we take for granted are not found in the old books. For example, we saw vomiting is not mentioned. And also it doesn't even seem like an important point. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you pericardium 5, and we can compare pericardium 5 to pericardium 6. In the old books, pericardium 5 was so much more important. It had so many more indications, and also in case studies, we see pericardium 5 used relatively frequently, but we don't see pericardium 6 in case studies from the old books. So pericardium 5 does mention vomiting a couple of times, and it has a bunch of other stuff. And so basically what I'm saying is that one of the reasons we can look at the old texts and gain some information is, maybe we should try, some other points and not always go to the same point and see if, like as an individual, some points really work well for me that don't work for other people. And some points really work for other people that I never had a rapport with that point. But when we study the old books, we can often see alternate views that may expand our ability to, select the best point for whatever situation. And on the topic of, how point indications and functions may have changed, stomach 40, we're going to see in 2 slides, okay? And stomach 40 does mention phlegm, but it's not like the major phlegm point. If today, anytime there's phlegm, the first thing people think of is stomach 40, regardless of where the phlegm is. But we're going to examine stomach 40 to see, does it seem like a major anti-phlegm point, 400 years ago? So, this is a question that I have. It's like, why do some of the indications that are so, important today, they don't show up in the old books? And it's not just Genjo Dacha. This is just an example, but I've looked through ancient point book after ancient point book. I've looked through the major ones, and this stuff just isn't mentioned, and different stuff is mentioned. So, this can give us more tools. This can give us more points. This can give us different ways of using the points to improve our ability to treat whatever patient shows up in front of us. Okay, let's look at pericardium 5, Jianshi. So it's in the concavity 3 cun from the palm between the 2 sinews. It's the place of traveling, which is the Jing River point, and it's metal. The notes to Su Wen say the needle is 6/10 of a cun deep. Retain it for 7 exhalations, 7 breaths. Tongren, the bronze man, says 3 fun deep. That's a big difference, 3 or 6 fun. Apply 5 cones of moxa. Mingtong, the Bright Hall, says 7 cones of moxa, and Zhenzhou Jai Jing says 3 cones of moxa. So, he's just giving us the information, and from that we can take a range of how deep to needle it, how many cones. Okay, so here's the indications for pericardium 5. Cold damage, Shanghan, chest bind. That's a very specific condition within Shanghan Lun. I'm not going to discuss it, but that's like a specific Shanghan Lun category. Heart feels suspended as if starving. That's kind of weird, but if you've ever been really, really hungry, your heart can maybe feel a little bit different. Next time you're really, really starving, pay attention and see if you can feel that sensation. Sudden mania. Okay, this point was used a lot in the old books for mental illness. This point was used a lot in the old books for what today would call phlegm misting the heart orifices. Severe mental illness. Okay, a rolling sensation in the chest. I don't know what that is, but it's phlegm related. Aversion to wind and cold. Okay, so Shanghan cold damage. Retching foam, vomiting up foamy stuff. So that's phlegm-ish. And that's vomiting. Okay, we didn't see any vomiting for pericardium 6. Apprehensiveness, so emotions. Cold strike with shortage of qi, so shortness of breath when external cold invades. Heat in the palms, swelling of the underarms. Pericardium is used a lot for swelling of the underarms. Hypertonicity of the elbow, so tightness in the region of the elbow. Sudden heart pain, frequent fright, wind stroke with qi congestion, rising drool, and critical clouding. So like somebody's losing consciousness and their mind is becoming very cloudy. Loss of voice with inability to speak, and a feeling of something obstructing the throat. That's subjective. That doesn't mean there is something. So that's like plum pit chi, maybe. Ghost evils. So, if a ghost is trying to possess someone, or if they're talking crazy talk as if they're talking to ghosts. Cholera, which is huoyuan, which is sudden turmoil, is a literal translation. Dry vomiting, and surprisingly irregular monthly, irregular menstruation. There are a few points on the heart and pericardium channel that treat gynecology. It makes sense because the heart has to do with blood. Pericardium has to do with heat in the blood, among other things. So, menstruation, a blood bind that develops into lumps. So the blood is binding and not moving, and now they're lumps. And another thing, childhood visiting hostility, which is like the child is just as if they're really freaking out, as if something, like children get nightmares and children get like phobias of, something under the bed or whatever. So it does have 2 that have to do with vomiting. And it has a lot more to do with like mental illness, although, not so much emotions, but mental illness. And you can see this has a lot more, indications. And it was just in the old books a much more important point. Okay. Let's look at stomach 40. So it's 8 sun above the external malleolus in the depression on the outer aspect of the lower leg. It's the low point of the foot yang ming. So there's a connection over to the spleen tai yin channel from there. Bronzeman says needle 3 fun deep, apply 3 cones of moxa, and Mingtong Bright Hall says 7 cones of moxa. Then here are the indications. Counterflow, and different types of counterflow, including something that might be like fainting. difficult defecation and urination. This point today still is in a lot of point formulas for constipation. Fatigue, sore legs and knees, difficulty bending and stretching, stabbing chest pain. This point is used as a distal point to treat chest issues. For example, even if you had physical trauma to the chest or you pulled a muscle in the chest, in the front of the chest, because of course, Yangming goes through the front. This point is commonly used for pain in the chest, but I'm not talking heart pain, just more like general, maybe orthopedic pain or stuff like that. Abdominal pain, like the cutting of a knife, because the stomach channel goes through that region too. Wind, phlegm, headache. Okay, so we've got some phlegm here, certain type of headache. Wind counterflow, swelling of the four limbs, feet that are the liver greenish color, generalized cold damp. Damp is related to phlegm. Throat B with inability to speak. That could be due to phlegm. Climbing to high places and singing, casting off your clothes and running about. So today we often attribute that to phlegm affecting the heart, but actually a lot of this kind of manic behavior was also attributed to like heat in the Yangming in the old books. Seeing ghosts and tendency to laugh. Again, those could be phlegm related too. But you can still see that this isn't like the major point for phlegm, even though there's like a couple of things that we could say seem like phlegm, but this isn't just like treats phlegm anywhere. It doesn't even mention cough. It doesn't mention any of that kind of stuff. Okay, with qi counterflow, there's throat B and sudden loss of voice. In excess, there's mania and withdrawal. So remember, this is the low point, and Lingshu chapter 10 has symptoms for excess and deficiency of the blood vessels. That's what it's talking about. Drain this point for those two things, the throat B, loss of voice, and the mania withdrawal. In deficiency, there's loss of function of the feet and withering of the lower leg. And in that case, you're going to supplement it. So that's just a little, glance at a couple of the points and how the old books talk about them. And I'll admit that, I'm more comfortable with modern books, but, can we say that the old books are wrong? Do we modern people know more than ancient people did? Well, in some regards, like Western medicine, of course, we know more than they did. But, I think that while we don't have to reject what modern books say, but if we examine what ancient books say, that may, just make us better doctors and make us closer to our medical ancestors. So anyway, that's my discussion for now.